This is a video response to a guy called The1janitor. He shortens his name to T1J. I'm going to shorten it again to 1J because I think that sounds much more like a name than T1J. So 1J has made this video. He's asked if we could sort of all engage in a nice way. I'm absolutely on board with that. That's something I've said before, so absolutely no problems with that. 1J, I hope, other than me telling you what you should be calling yourself, I hope you find this response is pleasant, is reasonable, right, and deals with the issues and doesn't get personal or anything like that. Now, a bit of a warning for everybody else. This video is about the wage gap, right? And that isn't so much a trigger warning as an oh my fucking god, not this shite again warning, because I know that this subject's been done to death. I was tempted to call this video Noah's Ark Mark II, right? Because I've been a YouTube atheist since 2008, and I always told myself I was never going to make a video on Noah's Ark. It's like a kind of rite of passage for YouTube atheists, is a Noah's Ark video, and I never wanted to actually do that. Then eventually I saw this video that I just had to respond to, and where I felt that I could say some things that nobody else had quite said in that way before, so I made a video called The Noah's Ark of Total Bullshit, which I'll link you to below if you want to watch it. It's had about 35,000 views, which is probably more than any other video on those kind of subjects that I've ever made. So I succumbed in the end, and now I'm succumbing on the wage gap. I have mentioned it in a couple of videos before. I've never done a video on the wage gap. That's effectively what this is, and it's a response to 1J. Okay, just a couple of bits that I wanted to respond, really, that he talked about. The first one was in this business of wage gap versus earnings gap. So let me play you a little clip of 1J.
So that whole it's illegal argument sort of transposes into this distinction between wage gap and earnings gap, which of the arguments I'm talking about today, this one is the most annoying. So people are like, wage gap is inaccurate. It should be called an earnings gap. And this is sort of related because people don't think that two people can be paid different amounts for the same job, which is not true. So, but they think that since that doesn't happen, then you shouldn't call it a wage gap. You should call it an earnings gap. Okay, first of all, this is a semantic argument, which are the worst kind of argument. When I'm trying to express an idea and then someone comes at me saying, you're using the wrong word to express that idea, I immediately take you a little less seriously because you're intentionally ignoring the main idea of what I'm saying and focusing on the semantics of the fucking syntax. Don't do that. But I mainly want to stress that this is a semantic argument that diverts us from the actual thing that we're trying to talk about, and I don't appreciate that.
Oh, 1J, I cannot have been the only one who found this really, really confused. You said the really confusing bit was that you said something like, oh, well, if you think that people, because you think they can't be paid the same amount, different amounts for doing the same job, that it can't be described as a wage gap. It's absolutely nothing to do with that. And it's not as if nobody's ever explained the difference between a wage gap and an earnings gap. And then you say, well, it's just a semantic argument. I've got to ask you, 1J, what do you mean by that? I mean, I understand semantic arguments, semantics. It's like, well, you just want us to use one word rather than another. But it's not a semantic argument when those two words mean something that are tangibly different and relevantly tangibly different as these two words do here. If you and I do the same job, right? Or let's say we don't do the same job. We might be doing totally different jobs, but we both do 40 hours a week, 1J, and we're both getting the same wage. We're both getting paid the same amount of money for doing our 40 hours. But I'm a lazy tyke, and you're not. You're a real grafter, 1J, right? And you do an extra 12 hours every single week, right, to bring home a bit more money. And you're doing that at time and a half. So effectively, that's like another 18 hours pay that you're getting. Your earnings is going to be much greater than my earnings, but we're both getting the same wage. Can you not see the difference there? And this really wouldn't matter if men and women in the United States did exactly the same number of hours and did the same amounts of overtime as one another, but this isn't the case. Men tend to do more hours than women in the United States, and we have the stats for that. So this does make a difference between us using an earnings gap and a wage gap. And so that's something that needs to be taken into account. But then if you start talking about an earnings gap but call it a wage gap, then that's really, really disguising what it is that we're talking about. Let me give you a little personal example to really flesh this out, right? My wife she's more of a high flyer than I am, okay? She's a professional person, a teacher, and I'm not, okay? And her hourly rate of pay, 1J, is substantially greater than mine. It's about 1.5 to 1.6 times what my hourly rate of pay is. But about 23 months ago now, we had a little baby boy. Marvellous, best thing I've ever done. Right, but you imagine she's had that little baby boy in her belly for 9 months. When he's born, she was on maternity. I was back at work a week later. Okay, I'd made that little. I had to let go and go back to work. She didn't. She had maternity leave for 9 months. She had maternity leave. You can quite understand her wanting the same thing that nearly everybody I know that's been in the same situation, nearly everybody I know has done exactly the same thing here. Which is that the mother has not wanted to go back to work full time. She wants to spend a bit more of her time. Fucking hell, she's had that baby in her tummy for 9 months. She's then invested 9 months of her life 24/7 looking after. She kind of deserves the chance to now spend a little bit more time with that child, doesn't she? That's what I thought anyway. That's what she thought. We both minded with that. And so she has gone down from 5 days a week to 4 days a week, right? Now, we couldn't actually afford to do that, to be blunt, just as it started. So I've had to do more work on the back of it, more hours. But I'm kind of fortunate, right? Because I was doing this as a hobby and I've managed to make this my work. Thanks entirely really to the people on Patreon who've supported me and allowed me to do that. If they hadn't, I'd be quite blunt, I wouldn't be making this video now. I'd be out driving a van or I'd be out labouring to make up that shortfall, right? But it had to be made. As a result of that, if you look at the statistics for my wife and I, right, I actually earn slightly more than she earns. I earn slightly more than she earns, but her hourly rate is about 1.5 or 1.6 times what my hourly rate is. And the reason she's doing less hours are entirely for her benefit there. It's for the benefit of our boy as well, right? But it isn't my sexism. It isn't because I hate women. It's not because of patriarchy or any bullshit like that, right? It's for her benefit, and it's a decision that she wanted to make, that I've helped empower her to make as a mother. Right, that is the situation. But if we lived in the United States and you punch our figures into your stats there, what would that show? I tell you what it would show. It would show yet another woman getting a raw deal in the workplace because I, as a man, am earning more money than she's earning. Right, so that's a pretty bad thing. But it's worse than that. He's dead, Jim. No, it's worse than that, 1J, is that it's not even then described accurately as an earnings gap. Right? It's then called, just to disguise what it actually is, we then refer to it as a wage gap, just to confuse the matter even more. So I put it to you, can you not understand why people would take issue with this? Maybe if enough people keep taking issue with this, eventually people might decide to start reporting this as an earnings gap rather than a wage gap. It'll still be a crap figure to pick. And the problem that I've just brought to you will still be there in the stats, but at least people will say, why have they started, the average Joe and Joanne in the street that aren't paying full attention to this, why have they started calling it an earnings gap and not a wage gap? And then somebody will say to them, well, that's because what they've been measuring all these years is earnings, and that includes all the overtime that people do. And it turns out that men in the United States do more overtime than women, and so it was kind of misrepresenting the statistics there. So can you understand now why it's important? And it's not just a semantic difference, this earnings gap versus wage gap. Right, now this was the other problem that you had, 1J, which was that you had a problem with people saying the wage gap is a myth. So let's have a little look at what you had to say there.
Okay, so one comment that I got a lot was this small leftover unexplained gap that's probably under 10% is not what people are referring to when they talk about the wage gap. When people say the wage gap is a myth, we're talking about that 77 cents on the dollar thing that all these people, are, including the president, have talked about. So a lot of people are saying, yeah, we agree with you that there's a small unexplained pay gap, but that's not what we're talking about when we talk about the wage gap myth. So if you want to say that the idea that women make 77 cents or 80 cents to a man's dollar is a myth, then say that. Don't say the wage gap is a myth, because that sentence is false.
Whoa, you know, I could have almost sided with you on this, because I've said that before. This kind of thing that you've said, I've said the same kind of thing, that it's a little bit misleading to say the wage gap is a myth if you accept there is a wage gap. But what I don't think you're doing is being even-handed, even in the slightest, here. Because on the one hand, you have a group of people who, and this just crops up every time these statistics come up, doesn't it? It's like a fucking, it's like a recurrent event. Every time a new set of statistics come up, the conversation resets because the wrong statistics are used, earnings gap is used, and then it's not even called earnings gap. And so the same defences have to be made. And you said about, well, maybe, I get the picture having watched your two videos, that you accept there's about an 8 or 10 cents gap. But even if that 8 or 10 cents gap was totally dealt with, and so we shrunk that wage gap, the wage gap from 77 cents to 87 cents, right? That would still be on the news, wouldn't it? That there's a wage gap of 87 cents, even though all of it was entirely legitimate as far as you were concerned, right? So why are people still using this erroneous statistic? Well, the defense that I've heard each and every time is something along the lines of, it starts a conversation, or it gets people talking. In other words, what people are saying is, this is an issue that they care about. And they're worried that if they use an accurate statistic, that other people might not be as motivated as they are, right? So what they do is they hide behind a statistic that misleads people to get people as motivated as they want them to be, rather than as motivated as they would be if they knew what the actual statistic is. It's a little bit cynical, it's very, very misleading, and it's somewhat deceptive to do that. And surely that is as much of a problem as it is anybody saying the wage gap is a myth. And if that is acceptable for people to do that, to say, well, let's use this 77 cents in the dollar mark because it starts a conversation, right? Surely it's acceptable for somebody to use exactly the same reasoning to say the wage gap is a myth. Right, because if you have problems with the statistic that's used, earnings, you have the problem with the fact that earnings is then described as wage, you have these fundamental problems and you want to get people talking about those problems, then maybe saying wage gap is a myth is your method of stirring the hornet's nest. Maybe that's your method of get people talking, because it might not be strictly accurate, because there still might be this residual, right? So there still might be a wage gap, but it's going to get people talking. And maybe if you keep banging on long enough about that, then people will relent and start using a more relevant statistic and start mislabeling the statistic that they are using. That's just a suggestion there. What I want to add, just as a little thing, is that there are better statistics to use that can quite easily be used. You're using earnings in the United States and dressing it up as wage. In the United Kingdom, we have our own issues with the way that the data's manipulated, right? And I've discussed that in other videos. I'll put a link down below how it's manipulated in the United Kingdom by conflating part-time and full-time workers so that the gap more represents the difference between part-time and full-time work than it does men and women doing the same kind of thing. But what we show in the United Kingdom is we do hourly rate of pay. So if you compared my statistics and my wife's statistics in the United Kingdom as we live, right, it would reflect accurately that she's getting a much higher rate of pay than I am, and so you'd see what the actual balance was, whereas in the United States it would misrepresent it. So there are better types of data that are available there. And my point to you, 1J, would be, if it's okay for people to quote these really misleading statistics to start a conversation, then it's equally okay for people to say the wage gap is a myth to start a conversation, if those conversations they deem are worth starting. That's pretty much all that I wanted to say. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.